Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is our cranial and our facial bones. So when we talk about the cranial and the facial bones, they make up the entire skull. So the cranial bones are going to be the bones that make up basically the top of the skull, and then the facial bones make up the bones of the face. So I've got two skulls here. I've got one that's missing the lower jaw and one that's not. I'm going to use both of these to kind of explain the difference between these. So let's start with our cranial bones. So again, when we talk about cranial bones, the first thing I want you guys to notice when I'm looking at these specific skulls is these lines. These lines are actually going to go through and separate the individual bones. You can also see them on this skull here. So again, the lines are separating the individual bones. So it's a little more prominent on this one, so I'm going to talk about the cranial bones on this model here. So the first couple of bones that we have are going to make up the superficial skull, and they're a little easier to see, so those are going to be the ones that I talk about first. So the bone that makes up your forehead is the frontal bone. It's on the front of your skull. So again, notice this line here. This is all part of the frontal bone. This line, you can ignore it because it's just basically holding the two parts of the skull together. And we'll look at that in a little bit. So that's our frontal bone. So we have one of those. Our next two bones are the parietal bones. So if you look at the top of the skull, you'll notice that there's this line here right down the center. It separates these parietal bones on the top of the skull. The temporal bones, I want you guys to notice this line here. Okay, so this is frontal here, this is parietal. The side of your head is the temporal bone. If you think about your temple side of your head, that's the temporal bone. And then the last major bone that's superficial is the occipital bone. So this is the back of the skull here. You can see this line here. So that is the occipital bone. So there is a structure in the occipital bone that I do want you to know. So if we flip the skull upside down, we're going to see this large hole. Magnum means large. Foramen means basically a hole within a bone. So this is a large hole in the bone, so it's called the foramen magnum. And that is actually where your spinal cord is going to exit from your brain. So your brain's up in your skull, spinal cord's going to extend downward. It goes through that foramen magnum. Two other bones that we're going to find in the skull are the sphenoid and the ethmoid. So these bones actually make up the eye sockets. So on these, the first thing I want you to notice is that we have on this one here, right next to the nose, we have a bone that has a hole in it. That's actually part of the facial bones. But behind it, the medial eye socket and then the lateral eye socket, as well as the back of the eye socket, let's see if we can see the lines here. So this line here of demarcation, this first bone right here on the medial eye socket on either side is the ethmoid. And then behind it, the sphenoid is making up the back of the eye socket as well as the lateral side of the eye socket. So you can actually see another line right there. So that bone in the back is the sphenoid. There is another location where you can see these two bones. If you remove the skull cap, you can actually see inside of the skull this bone here. So that one right there is the ethmoid. And this one here, it kind of looks like a butterfly or a bat wing. That is the sphenoid. So if we took those out, this is what they would look like. So this is sitting like that, okay? So if we're looking this way, this is where your eye socket is. Your medial eye socket is made up by the ethmoid. So this is the top of it, which we're looking at this way, and this is what's actually projecting into the eye socket. And then this is creating the back of the eye socket, and this is the top of it here. So notice how I said it kind of looks like a butterfly wing or a bat wing. That's that one here. This is the sphenoid, and this is, again, the ethmoid. So it's sitting right there. So this is what they actually look like. So when we talk about the eye socket itself, and if we place this here, you can actually see parts of the sphenoid on the lateral side of the skull. So again, back of the eye socket, lateral eye socket is the sphenoid. With that lateral is going to be sitting here. Toward the medial side of the eye socket is going to be that ethmoid. So again, these two bones. Ethmoid kind of looks like a walnut. Sphenoid kind of looks like a butterfly wing or a bat wing. All right, so those are our cranial bones. Let's talk about our facial bones. So again, when we talk about facial bones are the ones that make up the face. So the first thing we need to understand is that the upper and lower jaw are separate bones, and we can actually see that on this skull a little bit better. The lower jaw is the mandible, And the upper jaw where we have teeth is the maxilla. If we flip the jaw over and we flip the skull over, you'll notice that there's actually this line right here that separates these two bones. So the bone that has all the teeth, so all the teeth up into here, is the maxilla. This bone right here is called the palatine bone. Think of your hard palate. The hard palate is the roof of your mouth. So the maxilla makes up where your teeth are. The palatine makes up the back of the roof of your mouth, or that hard palate. Our next bones are our zygomatic bones. So these bones here, these are your cheekbones. Same thing here. So cheekbones are zygomatic bones. Then we have the nasal bone. So the nasal bone is what makes up the nose, basically the bridge of the nose here. And then right next to the nasal bone, remember how I said we have this bone here that has the hole in it? This is actually a tear duct. So this right here is called the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal gland produces tears. The lacrimal bone is where those tears are going to empty and drain. So the little bone with the hole in it is the lacrimal bone. And if you've ever ugly cried, it's because those tears are running through that lacrimal bone and going into your nose. So again, nasal here, lacrimal here. Looking inside of the nose, we basically have two major bones. Notice that we have the septum that separates the left and the right. So the lower portion of that septum is the vomer. And if we actually flip it over, we can actually see that vomer here. So that's the vomer, is this lower portion of the nasal septum. And then when you look inside the nose, you'll actually see these things that are projecting off of the lateral walls. The inferior nasal concha, I want you to think about this. Inferior means below. So it's going to be these two bones here. The inferior nasal concha, inferior means below, nasal means it's inside of the nose, and concha means it's basically these projections. So these projections off the lateral walls are the inferior nasal concha. So inferior nasal concha, vomer, nasal, lacrimal, zygomatic, maxilla, palatine, and mandible. Those are your facial bones.